All right, thanks for coming. See some familiar faces here. My name's Brian Fox. I'm co-founder, CTO at Sonatype. I have a long background in open source through the Maven project at Apache. I was the chair of that project a long time ago. As I mentioned this morning, Sonatype still runs the Maven repository. So if you're doing Java, and everybody's doing Java these days, you're downloading open source components from those services that we've always provided. I'm also currently a governing board member of the OpenSSF. So that's a little bit of my background. So this shows the growth of the downloads of Java from Maven Central. And every single year, the growth continues. So people talk about Java's passé and past its prime, but we're not seeing any evidence of that. These growth charts look exactly the same as NPM and other popular repositories. It just shows what I think everybody here already knows, that open source is really critical and is continuing to grow as more and more organizations actually adopt it. Okay, thank you. So I'm going to talk a little bit before we get into the legislation about why the legislation is coming and what the problems are. So these are some old slides, but I think they're still really relevant. So if we think about the economics of cybercrime, and especially, I presume most of you are here from financial industry, you feel this firsthand. But in 2016, this was what, that's 6 years now? 7 years now. The worldwide drug trade was a $435 billion industry. That same year, cybercrime was already bigger, right? So 7 years ago, cybercrime became a bigger industry than all of the war on drugs. And if you think about that, the opioid crisis and the war on drugs and the cartels and all of that was already a smaller industry way back then. And certainly at that time, 7 years ago, we weren't talking about this so much. Some of the financial industry was. They were some of our early customers with our products. But by and large, people were not paying attention. This was before SolarWinds, before Log4j. And so if we look at the growth of that, it was at that time predicted to be a $6 trillion industry, far outpacing the drug trade, which is fairly flat. Turns out it's hard to move physical product versus cybercrime and crypto and all of those kinds of things happened in that same time frame. And that more or less came true. This was a prediction that came back in about 2016. And now they're predicting it's going to be a $10.5 trillion industry just 2 short years from now. And again, you folks are all in this industry. I'm sure you know this. I'm sure you feel this. But if you think about this from an investor perspective, that money that's driving that industry, that's what's fueling the attacks against us. Right? So if you were an investor, you'd be looking for that hockey stick growth. And that's why we're seeing more and more and more against us. Now, when we think about the actual intentionally malicious attacks on the supply chain, I started talking about this and first saw some of the early ones in 2017. There were a smattering predating that, but really the systematic attacks on the supply chain started in 2017. And it grew a little bit. I used to give talks where I could talk about the attack of the week because there were 10, 15, 20. Eventually it got a little bit harder to go through each one of them. But it's continued to explode year after year after year. 430% the next year, the year after that, 650%. Last year it grew again, 750%. And then last year, we just put this out in our 9th annual State of the Software Supply Chain report, it doubled, right? And so the growth rates are slowing a tiny bit, but that's because we're not growing on small numbers anymore, right? The number that came out last year, the number of components that were intentionally malicious was equal to all the years combined. Right, and so don't be calmed by the fact that it's only a 50% growth as opposed to 70%. It's on much, much bigger numbers. So I think it's not a coincidence that rise in the cybercrime industry basically looks like the same hockey stick growth as these intentionally malicious components. And I have reporters ask me, do you think it's a bunch of nothing? Do you think that these don't matter? And I'm like, look at the numbers. The attackers have ROI. They're spending their time. They're not working for free. They're trying to steal our money. So the fact that they're doing more and more of them is showing that these are actually successful. Otherwise, why would they keep doing it, right? And paradoxically, I think the sophistication of these attacks right now is very low. which also is indicative that we as an industry are woefully unprepared to deal with it, right? So I look at all of these things sort of an evolutionary type viewpoint, because I think they iterate just like we do. If we finally get good at blocking something, they'll figure out the next thing. And I think that the supply chain they found back in 2017 was a big, fat, sweet, undefended target. And these numbers show that 7 years later, that's still the case. And that's really sad. So after Log4j, a couple years, we're almost 2 years now, right? We're at 23 months, I think, from Log4j. There was a sort of a collective freak out. A lot of people woke up to the fact that lots of critical infrastructure was using open source. And I kind of, my eyes were rolling nearly every day as I looked at the headlines, because we had been trying to help people solve this problem forever. But the conversation largely focused on like, oh no, we need to throw more money at the problem. And oh no, they need help from the feds. Let's throw some government action at it. And what's this one? Lack of support, the maintainers. I mean, all of these things are kind of true. Oh no, it's free and open source. Who's going to pay for it, right? So it was sort of like the mass awakening within the industry, I think, around this open source challenge that still, despite SolarWinds, despite Struts vulnerability that got Equifax hacked, and the Struts vulnerability that Anonymous exploited, all the way back in 2013, those are the reasons why the financial industry, I think, woke up to this early on. But the rest of the software industry really only figured this out 23 months ago. And the press and legislators, same thing. And so, we need to create policy. So, of course, the legislators come to action, and there were, congressional hearings on Log4j. The Apache Software Foundation president had to go testify. There was a lot going on there, which I think was focused on the wrong part of the problem. Like, there was a lot of work that came out that said we need to do a better job educating software developers. We need to provide more tooling and all these things. And from where I was sitting, I was looking at a very different problem. So again, we're the company that runs the Maven Central repo. This is the adoption of the Log4j fixes back in the first, I think this is like the first 6 months. And initially I was encouraged because there was a huge uptick in the first few weeks. We got to about 50%, right? So the red is all of the previous versions that were known to be vulnerable. And then each color was the patches as they found, successive issues that they released. But what we could see was that there was really only about 50% of the industry that was actually paying attention. The other 50% continued to consume those known vulnerable versions of Log4j. And as we sit here today, almost 2 years later, this is still at about 25%. So that thing finally started to curve down, but not in a way like it should. And if you think about that in terms of like consumer behavior, manufacturer behavior, as I like to do, I'll talk about that a little bit in a minute. You probably all remember the Takata airbag incident, right? A couple years ago, it was like a rolling recall, and it was a big deal. Can you imagine what would happen if pick an auto manufacturer was putting those airbags into 2024 model year cars today? Like, that would be outrageous, right? That's what's happening right now with Log4j. These things that are 2 years old, known to be vulnerable, the biggest, most widespread vulnerability in our ecosystem to date, and people are still shipping software with it. So when I look at that, I'm like, the problem is not so much the open source maintainers. The Log4j team fixed that over a holiday weekend when it was irresponsibly disclosed, and yet 23 months later, a quarter of the people are still including it in their software. So they're not the problem. In fact, we looked at this closely in last year's supply chain report, and by the way, that's the URL at the bottom. All the previous year's reports are there. And we found that when something was being consumed that was known to be vulnerable at the time they were consuming it, 96% of the time there was already a fix available, right? So the focus on we need to make maintainers better is at best solving 4% of the problem. And unfortunately, we just a couple weeks ago released this year's report. This number is still at 96%. So another whole year later, it basically didn't change. And so I've been doing this a long time. I don't get my hopes up. I look for small changes. But I think the regulation is actually going to change that a bit. So because as an industry, we've kind of done a terrible job at fixing this problem ourselves, the regulations are here. So a couple years ago, you're probably familiar with this by now, Biden's executive order focused on improving cybersecurity. The big outcome from this was sort of the eventual mandate of SBOM, software bill of materials, for anything being sold to the US government, right? And that comes into effect soon, if not, I've lost track of the years now. It might have come into effect actually this past August. And so the bill of materials, as people produce them for the government, doesn't solve the problem. You know, I've talked to so many people, this is why I'm jaded, they basically look at it as like, I just need to list out the ingredients and send it to the government. I don't have to do anything with it. And that's the equivalent of the auto manufacturers saying, you know what, we're not going to do recalls anymore. We're just going to print out that inventory and we're going to put it in the glove box when we sell a car and we're going to leave it to the consumer to deal with it later. Like that, when you look at the letter of the SBOM law, that's what it's asking for, and it misses the mark quite a bit. But what I've seen in the interim is that it's keeping the conversation within the groups, and the amount of people focused on producing SBOMs actually growing. I'll show that on the next slide. But in parallel, this year, the FTC has required this for approval for any new medical devices. Right? So there are parts of the government that are getting much more progressive on these types of things, especially medical devices is really important because those things get created and then they get abandoned in hospitals for decades and they're still running like Windows XP or God knows what. You know, you see some horrible things there. And think about what happens when they put, you know, embedded insulin pumps inside of people and they don't have the ability to upgrade them and they have Bluetooth stacks on them. You know, those things are vulnerable. So I think this is much needed policy to help do that. It's sensible. I think I need some new batteries here. So this year we did a survey on SBOMs, and while the numbers aren't huge, I think it's showing progress, right? So again, a long arc, 2 years since the mandate. It went into effect this year. You know, I think these are respectable numbers. How many people here are doing SBOMs by any definition, producing, consuming? Like 1? 2? Okay. All right, so this room is statistically much worse than the people we surveyed. So, what's that? Or you're more honest, yeah, that's fair. You know, but we'll get there. And I think that if you can't even produce the inventory of what's inside your software, you have no chance of actually responding to any of the things. So while the bill of materials in and of itself is not useful, it is actually the first step in getting to the process of doing the things that are useful. If you don't know what's in there, if you don't know you have log4j, how do you fix it, right? Earlier this year, the Office of the National Cyber Director released the sort of the 10-year National Cybersecurity Strategy. This was pretty cool. I got the opportunity to provide feedback on it before it became public, but actually out of the box, it was pretty good. And I was prepared for a fight when I went in there because, as I'll talk about in a minute, I had just been doing reviews and providing feedback on Europe's version of this, and it's a train wreck. And I'll talk about that a bit more. So I went in there expecting, you know, like this is going to be a nightmare, and actually looked at that and said, you know what, this makes sense. They're talking about that we need to shift liability onto the entities that are failing to take reasonable precautions when they fail to live up to the duty of care. And you know, those are scary words for software industry, but we're not the first. We're just the only one that hasn't gone through this. So when we started doing some research on this, we found one of the landmark cases in food was not even 100 years ago, 1932. In 1932, unless you had a contractual relationship with a manufacturer, you couldn't sue them. Now think about that. What consumer has a contractual relationship with, in this case, a beer manufacturer? Like nobody, because you go to the bar and you buy the beer. And so that's what happened in this instance. Somebody bought a beer. It was contaminated with a snail. They ended up getting sick from this, pretty sick. They didn't die. And then they tried to sue the manufacturer. And during the initial court cases, it was kicked out because the understanding of the law at the time was you can't, the bar didn't do this, but but the bar is the one who has the contractual relationship. And basically, people looked at that and started to get smart, and they said, we don't accept this. This is not an acceptable answer. And so through appeals and things like that, they ultimately came to the conclusion, the judgment, the written judgment basically said, like, it's not reasonable to expect the end consumer to be able to make a reasoned decision on the safety of what's inside the beverage. Those people, us as consumers, do not get to go to any company and tour the plant. So you can't walk in there and go, I'm not buying that beer because there's snails crawling all over it. And so for that reason, society should have the ability to place an expectation of a duty of care on their manufacturers. And we should hold them accountable when they fall below that, right? And so again, it wasn't even 100 years ago that the food industry was accountable to us as consumers. I think we all grew up in a time when you expect that that's the case, and there's recalls and all kinds of things, and people sue the manufacturers all the time when they do crazy stuff. But this is relatively new, when you think about how long food has been provided for humanity. So around the same time, this one actually about 10 years earlier, 1919, there was another landmark case against the Buick company, and the shape of that was basically the same. The contract law said the person who got injured, there was a clearly identifiable defect in the wheel that the manufacturer should have been able to see by looking at it going, this is not going to work, this is going to fall apart. And it fell off, and the guy crashed, and he got hurt, and he tried to sue Buick. And it was kicked out initially because he bought the car from the dealer. The dealer bought the car from Buick. Same, third-party chain that was going on with the snail case. And same basic outcome. When it went through the court, one of them was over in Europe, this one was here in the US, they basically said the same thing, like, this is ridiculous. It makes no sense that manufacturers of mass goods are not responsible for the damage that it causes when they, again, fall below a reasonable duty of care. Like, if they could see that the tires and the wheels were defective and they sold it anyway, we, society, should hold them accountable. Right? So when we think about what's going on with the software industry, software liability is really scary. And I look at this, again, from evolutionary perspective going, it's going to happen. We might get a few more years because Congress is currently dysfunctional. But the shape of this is going to land in that we are going to be responsible for this. So the OECD National Cyber Strategy basically said the same thing, and it makes sense. When you look at it from my perspective, we've tried to do all these things, and consumers are still failing. Publishers, open source consumers, vendors, all of us here, consumers of open source, are failing as an industry to do the right thing, and so that's why we're seeing these laws. So on the US side, they launched that. We had the EO. The last handful of months, man, they've been busy. I spend a lot of time both at Sonatype and also on the policy committee, both at Apache and also at OpenSSF, responding and reading to some of these things. Just a couple months ago, they put out an RFI for information on open source security and memory safety. Actually, we're submitting the response to that next week. They gave us more time. Not too long after that, CISA released the open source security roadmap, focusing on how they're going to work with organizations like the ones I just mentioned, but also vendors to provide specific types of outcomes, right? Treasury, same thing. I know some of you here might have been subjected to a horizontal audit, depending on where you are in the financial industry. You don't have to confirm or deny it. I know it happened. I also know that they were asking lots of questions about open source and looking at your supply chain and these types of things, right? So the government, the US government, is taking this seriously. Just on Thursday, they released an RFI for software identification. So how do you provide software bill of materials when there's no standard industry-wide for talking about components, right? Within Maven and other ecosystems, we have strong coordinate systems, but if you're talking about like Microsoft Word or any other piece of software, there's no official standard, and this is going to be a problem eventually for bill of materials. So that's coming. Now let's talk in the last few minutes about what's going on in the CRA. So this is in Europe. It might come out of their commission next week and then go to the member states to be ratified, but there's a lot of scary stuff in here. So I violated my usual rules of not having lots of words on slides, because the takeaway I want you to take here is this is really scary and there's a lot of stuff coming. And so the gist of this, if you think about any device that you've purchased, pretty much anything in here that could also be sold in Europe, it's going to have a CE mark on it, right? So physical goods go through and they get certified. Well, they're basically changing the law to say all software is going to have a CE mark. And they're also creating a lot of penalties and a lot of requirements for being able to deal with these types of things. And so, the sanctions for this is the important part, that they're $15 million euro sanctions. And this applies not only to software that gets distributed, but it's anything, quote unquote, placed on the market. So services, that I think particularly applies to the financial industry, would also have to be certified as through these things. So 15 million euros minimum, or 2.5% of the worldwide income. So that can be pretty scary for a bank. Those are the potential sanctions for violating these things. And the requirements go on and on and on. Come on. Any of these types of things, huge list. You have to be able to guarantee support for something like 15 years. You have to be able to report to them. Every government these days wants to be the first to know when there's a vulnerability, and you're supposed to report it to them. Vulnerability management requirements. So this is a huge document. But the real danger is actually falls on companies inside of Europe. Right now, they are intentionally putting these obligations also on open source foundations and open source producers. And they have this opinion that open source is the arm of American big tech or something like that, and that it must be regulated. And so the problem that I have with that is that a lot of open source software is developed in people's spare time as hobbies. Not all of it, but a significant amount of it is. And for that reason, you kind of don't have leverage over them. Like the rest of us open source developers who don't live in Europe, we can choose not to distribute our open source to Europe. It's going to be a disaster if we start changing our licenses that say everybody in the world can use it except for if you're in Europe, or if we end up in a situation where software repositories have to make it so that you can't download the components in Europe. It's almost Armageddon if you think about it. But the actual implications of this are very, very real. There were some drafts that came out just in the past week that seem to be headed in the right direction, but we've been dealing with this for about a year now, trying to get this on course. And so, whereas the US approach, I think, is very sensible and kind of matches what I think will eventually happen, what's happening over there is taking a very strong hand and not treating open source any differently than any other software. And I'm not saying that open source shouldn't try to be secure. I'm simply making the observation that when you have no leverage over a group of people who can opt out, trying to put those extra requirements on it are likely going to box out their own ecosystem. And I think that's a very dangerous thing for everybody. And it's actually not just the CRA. In parallel to that, there is a directive working its way through the legislation in Europe called the Product Liability Directive, which basically is your typical liability laws that are over there. Today, they exclude software. Anything digital is not included. So cars, food, all those kinds of things. The fundamental change here is to say, okay, we're removing the exception for software, and that opens up a whole bunch of other problems as well with potentially unlimited liability caps. You can be sued for data breaches. You can be sued for mental anguish. People worried about your data getting stolen, I guess, potentially becomes relevant in this. And again, it doesn't have protections as it sits right now for open source, at least not ones that are clearly defined. So again, if you were an open source developer, would you risk a huge liability lawsuit and put your stuff on the market in Europe for something that you make no money off of? Like, I don't think many people would do that. And so if this comes to pass as it's currently written, same type of outcome that happens on the CRA. So this is what we're dealing with in the industry right now. Again, because we haven't fixed it, we've got some sensible approaches, and we've got some over-rotation of other approaches. So basically, all software is going to be covered by this. And again, if you think that you're going to get away with it for a while because the US isn't going to pass any laws that change this, you're sort of right, except we're all global companies and every other major economy is doing the same thing. So it's US and Europe, it's Canada, Japan, Australia, UK, New Zealand even. India has some strong protection. So again, I look at this as it's inevitable, right? So if you're not able to produce bill of materials, and all but 2 of you seem to not be able to do that, the clock is ticking. You might not have enough time to get in shape. So again, remember, we're not the first ones. We're just the most recent ones to have to deal with this. So self-evaluation, if I told you about a new vulnerability right now, say log4j, how long would it take you to answer in your organization? Are you even using this component anywhere? Any version of it? Many companies can't do that in a reasonable period of time, again, because of the bill of materials. So I'm going to assume all but 2 of you can't easily answer this question. And then if you can't answer that question, you can't do this. You can't actually start to target it, and you can't start to triage it. And how long would it also take you to ship and update it, right? And so if you can't do that, how would you avoid the next malicious release? How would you avoid shipping something with those disclosure requirements that Europe is going to require of you, right? So we're in a bad state. Within a lot of these talks, we usually talk about DevOps and Edwards Deming and supply chains and all these types of things that we try to learn from the manufacturing industry. So this is a picture of a Tesla plant. When we think about the supply chain best practices, those things are designed to produce better and cheaper and more reliable cars, right? So if we think about that in our terms, doing all of these things, having bill of materials and being able to rapidly ship and update, that's all great for the software you produce. But what it's not focused on is it's not protecting the factory, right? So if a suicide bomber wants to blow up that factory, having better relationships with manufacturers and being able to recall your parts is not necessarily going to help that. And like I talked about during the keynote this morning, during the panel session, many of these attacks that are focused on the developers and the development infrastructure are flying under the radar because they're not trying to get into the software we ship. They're trying to blow up your developer machines and steal the credentials. And if you're only looking at the products that come out the end of the factory, you're completely missing what's actually happening in this new war. I can do a whole talk on that, but I just at least want to open your eyes to this is a problem that you need to be focused on. Now, a little bit of happy news at the end, since I know this has been very dark. A couple years ago, we did some surveys of a lot of different companies, and we kind of put them into these different categories here. You've got the companies at the top left. They focus on security is the most important thing. We don't even care if it means we only ship once or twice a year and we go super slow, but we're going to be very thorough. Those are the ones in the top left. Opposite them, bottom right, they're like, we're going to go as fast as we can. Security be damned. We're just going to ship and break things later. And then the others are combinations of that. And so if I told you, after everything I just said, that spending a little bit more time to be more thorough in your security was a worthwhile trade-off, that it was worth slowing down to be a little bit better, right? I don't think anybody would argue at this point that that's crazy. But what we actually found when we looked at the average of all of these is that the companies that solve for both of these simultaneously are both more secure than those who only care about security and faster than the people who only care about going fast. And that seems crazy at first, but then think about it. If you only cared about going fast, that doesn't give you an opt-out for log4j. It means you were completely unprepared for dealing with it. And if you only care about security, it means you don't have mechanisms in place to actually move quickly when you need to, which reduces the security posture, right? So we don't have to think about doing these things and preparing for software liability as a tax, even though one might be able to justify a tax is worth paying there. You can do this and you can actually be more productive. So you can actually produce better software and you can do it faster or cheaper or more quickly, right? And so that, I think, is the good news, that there are answers to this. This is an example, I mentioned this morning, of a large financial services company, 4,000 applications. When Log4j happened, they remediated 80% in 4 days, and they hit all of their portfolio days later because they already had the systems in place. So when we put the data into the system, the alerts went directly to the developers, told them exactly what to do. They knew exactly where they were affected. They updated and moved on. It was like no big deal. They got to have Christmas that year. Versus organizations that I spoke to that said, well, 6 months later, we were still trying to figure out where we were using this, let alone fixing it. So the evidence is real, and it's not just for Log4j. This was in last year's report. We looked at a number of other vulnerabilities. We picked these ones because they were not as high profile and not as widespread, because we were wondering if like the press release and the attention from all the reporters caused Log4j behaviors to be different. And we found out actually no, they were not different. Being prepared and having tooling in place is the difference. And so if you're not able to do that, you don't have tooling in place, you better get started, because liability is coming, it's inevitable, you better get ready for it. And so that's my time. Thank you for coming.